So thank you for sticking around. And here we go with our last panel of the day on AI regulation and environmental law. We are not going to take questions on cards. I'm going to walk around with a microphone at the end, and so you get to own your own questions, and please have them ready. Um, I should say before I get started, I am a lawyer by training. I've been looking at everything through the ethical lenses for the last 12 years, but I will be moderating this panel and I've been looking forward to it all day. I also wanted to clarify something that came up in the last panel, which was a discussion about distinctions between European regulations and US regulations, and the notion that we might get to see which one works best. The reality is that they all overlap and intersect, and all of the US companies are now being regulated by what's happening in the EU. And all kinds of impacts are happening from laws that are being passed in China. And so we don't really get to just experiment in a sandbox with laws. And there's also the interesting sort of middle ground of California law, which is different from the EU law and different from US law and tends to get passed more often than federal law. So it has a huge impact, especially given how many of the key companies are based in California and the fact that it's the fifth largest economy in the world right now, I think. So with that being said, let me introduce our two panelists. Betsy Popken is the executive director of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law. She directs the center's climate justice program, leads a team that is conducting a human rights impact assessment and model evaluation of large language models, and spearheads the center's work on international peace negotiations, currently focused on Ukraine. Drawing from her real-world experience, she also teaches courses on technology and human rights and international peace negotiations at Berkeley Law, and is regularly interviewed by information and communication technology companies conducting due diligence to assess human rights risks. Previously, she co-founded and co-led the business and human rights practice at the law firm of Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe LLP, where she honed a particular passion for helping clients tackle human rights issues raised by emerging technologies. Professor Tseming Yang is an environmental lawyer, professor at Santa Clara University School of Law, and policy advocate who has long focused on advancing understanding of the structure and role of the law with respect to the environment, as well as on ways to ensure that effective implementation will contribute to the achievement of justice and sustainability. In addition to his work on domestic environmental law and its intersection with civil rights and social justice considerations, his other areas of research and writing have focused on environmental law and international treaties, and in the law and governance systems of other countries, especially China. He's the author of Comparative and Global Environmental Law, published by Asthma Publishing in 2020, and a co-editor of a forthcoming handbook on comparative environmental law. So I've asked them three questions, and we're going to start with what role does current environmental law play in addressing the environmental impacts of AI development and deployment? And Tseming will take it away for us. And then Betsy's going to talk about some new laws and regulations proposed in response to those impacts so far, looking more at the international context. And they are both going to respond to the question, what should we be demanding of our representatives and regulators? And I'm hoping that you all think about that question as well, especially having taken in all the information over the course of the day. And looking forward to an interactive conversation with the whole room here. Thank you.
Let's see. Oh, no, right here. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Irina. I really appreciate and grateful for asking me to participate in this. I have to say this has been a great learning experience, especially as I've been sitting here this morning, this early this morning and today, listening to the speakers. Before I go on, I do want to acknowledge, whoops, let me go back, the help of my research assistant, Trevin Andersoria, who's put a bunch of these slides together for me. I've added to them. Just am happy to be participating in this. A couple of sort of personal notes. One is just a couple of weeks ago, as part of a listserv that I'm on with other environmental law professors, the issue of use of AI in our work sort of came up. And I sort of shared that I took one of these summer workshops where they showed us how to use ChatGPT and some of the other AI models to help with the teaching. And I immediately got a response back talking about the water usage and energy, high energy usage of AI. And I was immediately cowed into not saying too much about how I was using, which is, of course, unavoidable here in Silicon Valley. But it really sort of helped me focus on these broader issues. The other sort of personal note, I am by background just as an undergraduate, I studied biochemistry, and so I've always thought of myself as having a fairly strong science technology set of capabilities, where I've not been afraid of diving into technical issues. And I've found that this area has really just been incredibly daunting, that understanding how blockchain and all these algorithms work, which I do think is actually quite critical to gaining a full understanding of how these should be regulated, is really a really significant challenge. On the flip side, I've always been a fan of science fiction. In my childhood, I loved the robot novels of Isaac Asimov. I never could figure out how to incorporate that into my work, and so here we are. This is maybe the one start. All right. So let me move on here. So first of all, and my students are online. I've required them to listen into this. So hello, students. All right. So I want to breeze through. I do have a few slides just providing background, and I think most everybody here has been here all day, so I'm not sure that I really need to get through a lot of that. But one of the starting points, and what I've been hearing primarily about AI in the environmental context, really been overwhelmingly positive. That it's been used by regulators in the environmental context to help predict environmental risk and potential for violations, to inform policy decisions, to monitor air quality. This has come up with monitoring GHG emissions, methane emissions to track air quality. There's all sorts of stuff's been written. What AI is really good at, which is to crunch data. I think there was mentioning of just monitoring of fisheries in the oceans, and it's just even though we have the satellite data, as a practical matter for humans, it's just impossible to really review that. And so AI has been incredibly important in utilizing that. And then also with enforcement. One study showed a 600% improvement in detecting Clean Water Act violations compared to random site selection, simply because you can look through the data and essentially make predictions about where violations are likely to occur. Right? So there's a lot of positive applications here for AI that have been discussed. But the other side, of course, that we've spent most of the morning here talking about is the extreme energy usage, water usage, carbon emissions, e-waste, land use, and that hasn't been mentioned so much, just the use of rare earth minerals. Right? This is a broader issue now because most of it is being imported, especially from China. And over the past decade or so, China has really flexed its muscle in terms of restricting some of these materials. And so as a national security matter, I think these issues have become much more significant. This is a slide that my student put together just as an indication. I'm not sure that I really need this at this point, given everybody's been here this morning. But here's one other sort of specific reference point that I thought would really be valuable, which is as I was looking through the web for information, it was mentioned Northern Virginia is a top area for data centers in the country, right? Somewhere around, and the number that I saw was somewhere around 300 data centers. So it makes sense, right? They're supporting the federal government's use of the web and also the military, right? The military industrial complex. And the use is somewhere around close to 4 megawatts. I'm sorry, 4,000 megawatts, so 4 gigawatts. So just by way of comparison, the Grand Coulee Dam, which is the largest hydropower facility in the United States up in Washington, is rated a capacity of 7 gigawatts. Right? So essentially, Northern Virginia consumes about somewhere around 60% or more of just this one dam. And if you think about how much infrastructure goes into constructing those kinds of facilities, that's really very significant. The other reference point is the Three Gorges Dam, rated at 22 gigawatts. Three Gorges Dam has been hugely controversial because of all its social and environmental impacts. This is sort of part of the challenge here that this technology presents. To me, I think in terms of thinking about this, the analogy to crypto I thought was very, very useful. Both consume enormous amounts of computational energy in running the computational processes, and they really depend on a lot of cheap but also reliable energy, right? This was already referenced earlier on, that you can't really just run these applications, these algorithms on renewables, because renewables are not as available as more traditional thermal power plants or for that matter, nuclear, and then also the cooling. So there are some analogies here. The reason why it's useful is if you look at the regulatory landscape on crypto and also on, or especially on AI, this is so new that there's very little information. I actually, before, in preparation for this conference, I decided to call up colleagues that I still have. I forget now. Did you mention that I served in the Obama administration as Deputy General Counsel for a couple of years in the EPA. And I served also as an attorney in the U.S. Justice Department in the Environment Division. And there's just very little attention, I think, that is being paid to this. I shouldn't say attention, but it is not something that sort of imbues sort of the operations, discussions of the agency as, for example, climate changes. If you talk to anybody in the federal government and those environmental agencies, climate change comes up all the time. But crypto is sort of one of those areas where agency staff have paid a little bit more attention. And there's one sort of useful report that came up in my RA's research, which is the Earth Justice and Sierra Club prepared this report on all the energy and environmental impacts of blockchain and crypto mining, including issues like thermal pollution. And again, this came up earlier. There's one thing I wanted to point out. So 108 degrees Fahrenheit water discharge doesn't really seem like a big deal, right? I mean, this is just sort of bath water. One thing that was pointed out earlier, you discharge a lot in an area, that can actually significantly raise the water temperature. But here's one other really important thing. So if you don't locate it in the ocean, if you locate it near a river, the increases in temperature can have really, really significant ecological impacts, right? There is a reason why why the farmers in Central Valley complain about the state government releasing water into the rivers during dry seasons. It's because during the summer, of course, not only is water flow low, but when you have low flows in the streams and rivers, the temperature of the water increases, and it essentially makes it inhospitable for many of the species in the aquatic ecosystem, right? So raising the temperature really is a significant issue, for endangered species and lots of parts of the aquatic ecosystem. Just lots of heat. I think Betsy will talk a little bit more about these data centers, and also sort of noise. That's sort of some of the issues that the report talks about. The interesting thing about crypto is that there has actually already been one enforcement action by EPA on a crypto mine. This is the what's it called again? Greenwich gas plant in New York. And what happened there was this company essentially was trying to, and this is what a lot of these crypto mining companies have been trying to find, cheap, reliable energy. They found this old coal-fired power plant that was supposed to get phased out. They went in, purchased it. They didn't continue operating, which is, of course, a good thing, but they converted to gas so that you then had a continued operation of it. Unfortunately, they didn't figure out that as part of the expiration, the phase out of this power plant, they were also supposed to close out a bunch of coal ash ponds. These are sort of these gigantic piles of these residue of coal-fired power plants that nobody knows what to do with. They just get stored, and they really present very significant environmental risk. There have been incidents over a number of years ago where these coal ash ponds essentially spilled over and caused very significant environmental damage. You cannot keep. There was supposed to be a shutdown of these ash ponds. Some sort of closing down. They didn't do that, and they became subject of an EPA enforcement action. Had to pay $100,000. Not a lot in many respects, but this is sort of in many respects sort of an exception of where the federal government has been acting on these types of processes. So this is relatively new, but also unique because it deals with one of the situations where tech companies have been trying, in the process of getting reliable energy, have been essentially taking over existing power plants. And that's sort of one of the risks here, that as part of the energy transition, of course, from fossil fuels to renewables, the expectation is that a lot of the coal-fired power plants will actually go out of business, be shut down. They're no longer economical. With this increased demand of energy, that is, of course, changing the calculus. And there are other examples of where that's happening, and of course, the interest in nuclear as well. All right. I wanted to go to this one first before I get to sort of the hopefully what you're most interested in. How do we think about the applicability of environmental laws in the AI context? And this is sort of what I put together just as a way of thinking about this. AI obviously is sort of this amorphous set of algorithms, applications that depend on sort of these computational processes. But in terms of the environmental effects, where I would start is really what is the physical manifestations of AI in the real world, right? And so there are really three pieces to that. One is the electronic computing equipment. The second is the infrastructure support, the data centers, the transmission lines, et cetera. And then the third one is, of course, the energy generation infrastructure. The second and the third arguably are sort of part of the same, but I think it's useful to separate them out. And so the way here I thought might be most useful for the audience to think about this is for me just to go through what the applicable environmental laws are and to give you a sense of how and whether they apply and how so. In terms of energy, EP is not really directly involved in the regulation. This is really primarily the bailiwick of state agencies like the Public Utilities Commission here in California, also the State Energy Commission, the California Energy Commission. New power plants have to be licensed. At the federal level, of course, if they're interstate transmission line projects, a very large project end up also having to go through FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approval. But a lot of the processes actually focus at the state level. The California Energy Commission has jurisdiction over projects that are greater than 50 megawatts, and anything under 100 megawatts can actually be subject to an exemption. The reason why I mention that is because it turns out, and in addition, there's let me just mention also one other process. Point that doesn't work. I'll just tell you. I'm sorry, land development, which is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, right? This is a counterpart to, in the federal law, what we refer to as the National Environmental Policy Act, essentially environmental impact assessment process where whenever there is for the federal government, whenever there's a federally sponsored or federally licensed project, an environmental impact assessment has to be done. California does the same thing, broader scope, smaller projects, and it also includes, of course, power projects. It turns out, of course, that all of these data centers have to go through the CEQA process. And as part of the construction of these data centers, they always put in a bunch of diesel power generators, right? This is already mentioned. It turns out when you look through some of these CEQA documents, and I can't say I've done an exhaustive search, but it's been interesting here in Santa Clara. They always have, 40, 50, 30 backup generators that just go just up to the 100 megawatt limit. So they don't have to go through additional licensing, right? So you have suddenly 30, 40 of these diesel generators. They're not usually operated. But here's one thing that I would point out. So it turns out, and this is a broader environmental justice issue, the time when these diesel generators will probably be kicked into operation is probably during times when there are power outages or when there are disasters, right? When they're, and I'm thinking maybe less of California, where we have these rolling blackouts, because of heat waves. But in areas like in the South, in Louisiana, where the hurricanes, it's been well documented. In Texas, for example, Hurricane Harvey, when it came through, of course, damaged a lot of the infrastructure. It turns out that during that process, a lot of the pollution control equipment, the monitoring actually goes out as well. And it's been documented that there are extraordinary pollutant and toxics releases at the time. Imagine sort of during one of these power outages, during these disaster times, all of these things kicking in, and this is not going to be just one data center. Obviously, everything in the area will be affected. That will have a not insignificant effect on the community here. But most of this is really local. Air pollution is regulated under the Clean Air Act, but unless you deal with a very large power plant, again, most of it is done at the state and local level. Here in the Bay Area, it would be the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. The arrangement between the EPA and the state agencies is essentially that the EPA sets federal standards in terms of air quality, and that the states are then supposed to be implementing those standards. And so they're really the ones primarily engaged in permitting and overseeing these kinds of sources of air pollution. Clean water, the Clean Water Act. Water pollution, I have to say, I have not been as aware of specific water pollution issues, and I'm not sure that it's as relevant. But again, a lot of that is done at the state level. But water usage, I think, has been, of course, a significant issue. Again, EPA is not involved in controlling water use, water quantity, water allocation. That is part of the state regulatory scheme. And of course, if you're within municipal areas, these data centers presumably go to sort of the local water agency. Waste. Waste under federal law is governed largely by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This is the cradle to grave hazardous waste management regulatory scheme. It turns out that most electronic waste is accepted. Right? This has been a long-standing issue, especially with regard to e-waste recycling. A lot of it gets shipped over abroad. One of the key, gaps, regulatory gaps in this area is that when materials are designated for recycling purposes, they are not considered waste. And so you can see what the incentive here is for companies which is to figure out a process whereby you're actually not, quote unquote, disposing of these kinds of outdated electronic material, One of them, of course, is to export it abroad. That's become more difficult because in recent years, the major destinations for the e-waste have started to restrict the import of e-waste. But as a general matter, in the United States, it's largely unregulated, whether it's by companies because they use this process or by the end consumer because whatever you throw, and this is the other thing, whatever you throw into the garbage ends up being designated or classified as municipal waste. Municipal waste is different from hazardous waste. Hazardous waste is really bad stuff. But it turns out, of course, that in electronic equipment, you have lots of heavy metals and the like. Municipal waste is not regulated by EPA. There are lots of exceptions to EPA's regulatory coverage. And municipal waste is one of those. It's just because there's a lot of states that are supposed to do it. And so again, this is sort of left at the state level then. I mentioned here sort of a couple of international treaties dealing with waste generally. They have not really tackled the issue of electronic waste, even though there's been so much attention to it. I shouldn't say not tackled it, but there's sort of a special situation, especially for the U.S. The U.S. is the only country. Everybody in the world is a party to the Basel Convention on trade in hazardous waste. The U.S. is not, and it sort of has found workarounds there. Land development, Betsy will talk more about that, but we have sort of local, the state regulatory scheme. And the last item here I want to point out is disclosure, climate disclosure laws. Recently, California enacted SB 253 and SB 261. Both have been seen to be relevant with regard to climate disclosures of GHG emission. And they are going to kick in, but again, highly controversial. The tech industry, as far as I can tell, hates because I don't know. I guess disclosure and information is sorry. The one last thing here that I didn't put on is the White House executive order on artificial intelligence. It was issued a year ago, just a couple weeks ago, a week ago. The White House actually released a memorandum related to national security. The executive order, these executive orders get longer and longer. If you look at 30 years ago, there used to be one page. This one is 80 pages. It's all focused on the risk of AI use or the potential opportunities for AI use. I did a word search where environment comes up or climate, and you can tell by the way I'm chuckling here, it really is not part of that scheme. It of course addresses the question of whether AI might be misused, but the broader question of whether the sort of overall deployment of AI. What the environmental effects will be, climate effects, is not part of that. That doesn't mean that regulators will not be inquiring into it, but the bottom line is it's not really sort of part of that top-level vision, and that does influence sort of what the priorities are. So sorry, I'm going on a little bit longer here maybe than I thought. But here is really just a couple of additional slides here just to look forward to the last question that Irina had asked us to address. Why is it so difficult here? And part of what I'll point out here is that to some extent it's a new problem in terms of the technological and scientific complexity. I do think that you really have to understand this well in order to be able to regulate it. And there's this issue of this sort of distributed computing and infrastructure paradigm that where you don't really have, it's everywhere. But at the same time, this is sort of part of what EPA sort of dealt with in terms of pollution generally. That is, pollution is sort of dispersed, and that somehow it has these broader effects. The traditional sort of tragedy of the commons type of challenge. But we really have at least a couple of systemic issues that are not unique to technology and to AI, which is our environmental laws are entirely outdated. The modern environmental law system that we see now was created in 1970, early 1970s. The last time there was major environmental law reform in the United States was 1990. This is 35 years ago now, longer than the time period when it was created. And as a result, EPA and others are really dealing with outdated tools, and they have been trying to utilize them in creative fashions. And here's the other issues. Federal courts have been increasingly hostile, especially the Supreme Court, not only to the federal government, but to EPA specifically. There's really a great hostility. I think I would blame it in part on poor understanding by the federal judiciary. Judges are trained in the law. They're not trained in these scientific technical issues. It used to work because there used to be some deference, respect for the technical expertise of the agencies. That has really been whittled away by this Supreme Court. It's actually remarkable the last couple of terms, the kind of decisions that have come down. And really, this is sort of part of this broader, what I refer to as a power grab. I'm not alone, by the way, in sort of describing it. So I'll be happy to chat more about it. But the last thing that I want to show here is this is the bill that was introduced in both the House and the Senate, the Artificial Intelligence Environmental Impacts of 2024. The main takeaway here from is this is really largely about information gathering by sort of a consortium as well as by EPA to investigate. And hopefully that will then form the basis of more specific regulation. Right? Sorry for going on so long, but let me stop here then.
Step up, but I just wanted to comment on this act that as far as I know, it calls for a 5-year study and of the subject matter that we've been talking about all day. And my personal sense is that we have a lot of information about this and that we don't need in fact, we don't have time to have a 5-year study before we actually pass some laws, at least the transparency requiring ones that we've been talking about.
Okay, so I'm going to set a little background for what's going to frame my contents here today. So I'm the executive director of UC Berkeley Law School's Human Rights Center. We are beginning a project where we'll be looking at the environmental impacts of AI data centers on humans in the communities where they are built. And, you know, a fairly substantial amount has been done to examine the environmental impacts, and I really appreciate the work of Irina in organizing this and bringing all of these fabulous people with really in-depth knowledge of the different environmental impacts. Very, very little has been done to examine what those impacts have on humans. And I should note, I'll focus on kind of a particular part of it, but we'll be conducting qualitative interviews in communities surrounding an AI data center here in California to kind of assess for them the impacts it's had on various rights, and we'll cover those later. But we'll also be examining all of the permits required for an AI data center. And I'll give you just kind of a starting, I'll be reflecting on current California law. So there are 8 different permit requirements for data centers that I'll just highlight briefly. And they have particular relevance to data centers in various ways. So zoning permits, due to high energy use and noise from cooling centers and backup generators, data centers may face stricter scrutiny during zoning approval. Environmental review, because data centers have significant impacts on energy use, they often require more detailed environmental reviews to address power consumption and emissions from backup generators. Building permits, data centers have unique structural requirements due to the need for heavy-duty electrical and cooling systems. And utility and energy permits, the high power demand of data centers coupled with California's push for renewable energy means data center operators often have to pursue specific agreements or adjustments with utilities to ensure stable power supply. So that's 4 of them. 4 others that I want to highlight are air quality permits. So data centers frequently rely on diesel backup generators to ensure uptime, making air quality permits a more central focus. Water and wastewater permits. While not all data centers use water-based cooling, those that do need permits due to the volume of water used and the potential for wastewater discharge, making water use a potential concern during the permitting process. Fire department permits. Due to the concentration of electrical equipment, fire safety is especially important for data centers. They may require more advanced fire suppression systems, such as clean agent systems that don't harm electronic equipment. And construction permits. Data centers have unique needs, such as extensive power distribution networks, raised flooring for airflow, and cooling systems that make construction permits a high concern. So these are permits that all kind of big operations need to look at, but there are kind of unique needs of data centers that require kind of more stringent permitting processes. So as part of our preparation for this new project, we looked at in the countries that host the most AI data centers, are there any federal regulations specific to data centers? And, we found the proposed legislation in the US, which quite frankly was the weakest one we found. But I'll review some of the others. And again, looking at countries with high numbers of AI data centers. And I guess 2 common themes we saw were power usage effectiveness standards for energy efficiency. We saw these varying from 1.2 to 1.5, which is interesting because, as was mentioned earlier, both Google and Meta have PUE less than 1.2, but there still is the average is still kind of much higher than that. And then utilization of renewable energy, we saw varying from kind of a 10% increase each year to 100%. So Germany's Energy Efficiency Act was already mentioned earlier. This is what we found to be the strongest. And, just in brief, data centers that start operations before July 1st, 26 must achieve a PUE of 1.5 by that a year later, and 1.3 by 4 years later. And data centers that start operations after June 1, 2026 must achieve a PUE of 1.2. It also says data center operators are required to cover with renewable sources 50% of their electricity consumption from January 1st, 2024, and 100% from January 1st, 2027. Now, that doesn't mean all of the environmental issues are addressed, but that's the renewable energy part of it. And then data center operators must establish an energy or environmental management system by July 1st, 2025. That's a very date-heavy act. And I'm just pulling bits and pieces. The Netherlands, in Amsterdam, they kind of do it by districts with different kind of varying levels of data centers present. They said data centers must have a PUE of 1.2 and practice nature-inclusive construction. China has a more advanced action plan than the United States does. By 2025, the average PUE of data centers will be lowered to less than 1.5. Not the best standard, but better than nothing. And the utilization rate of renewable energy in data centers will be increased by 10% annually. So a goal to improve the use of renewable energy each year. Singapore. also more advanced. They at least have set standards, even if they haven't put particular numbers to them. But they set a roadmap to raise energy efficiency of all data centers by encouraging greater use of liquid cooling, reduce reliance on air cooling, and increase data hall temperatures, deploy energy efficient IT equipment, offer incentives and grants for resource efficiency, address software carbon hotspots, and data centers to achieve PUE of 1.3 or less over the next 10 years. Norway. This is something that we missed in a lot of them, but I think does need to be considered, and that's data centers with capacity exceeding 2 megawatts and other plants with more than 20 megawatts of supplied electrical power should perform a waste heat analysis. That's something you don't find in a lot of the other regulations, but would be really beneficial to at least understanding how much waste heat the data centers produce. Okay, so that's kind of the hard international law background, but I mentioned earlier, I'm a human rights nerd, so my focus is on kind of the impacts to humans, and while you need hard law to really regulate things, I'll share just kind of the overarching kind of international human rights guidance that we have on this. So the Paris Agreement was the first international agreement to recognize human rights as connected to climate change. And I'll read just that part of it. Parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. And then it was not until 2022, but we now have it, a UN General Assembly resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. And for those lawyers in the room, you know this is being used by lawyers globally to bring cases on behalf of plaintiffs who have been impacted by the harms of climate change. So when I say rights, what rights do I mean? And what do I mean by rights? So there's 5, I mean, there are well more than 5 that we can focus on. And certainly the right to a clean environment is one that would be violated. But I'll focus on 5. So the right to health is one. And I guess I should say I'm focusing on the rights of people who live in communities surrounding AI data centers. So these are people exposed to the immediate kind of localized environmental impacts of the data centers. So data centers often extract water, which can lead to less access to water for community members. They also create urban heat islands, and we know that heat can impact people's health. We also know that they cause air pollutants and that can impact people's health. So we know that there are conditions that can lead to poor health that are localized around data centers. So, you know, we can think big picture GHG emissions, but I think it's also important to focus on those kind of localized communities and the impacts on the people in those communities. Another one is the right to safe water and sanitation. Again, data centers often have cooling systems that reduce the access to water for the community because they utilize high amounts of water, and they have wastewater pollutants that sometimes taint the water. So the access to safe water is one that could threaten communities in like nearby data centers. Right to housing is another one. As there are extreme environmental impacts on a community, those houses could become less valuable. And I should note here that most data centers are built in already economically disadvantaged communities. And so these people now who are already in communities where they don't have kind of the best housing options. Now their home values go even further down and they don't have the means to move to another location. So the right to housing is another right that's impacted, can be impacted by AI data centers in a community. The right to livelihood can also be impacted. So, you know, if this data center is in a town where tourism is big, or fish, like the community relies on fishing or agriculture, the pollutant impacts and the environmental harm can really damage the livelihood of people who live in these communities. And my fifth point is right to access information. This is a human right. Currently, to my understanding, no companies, no governments are providing citizens who live in communities surrounding AI data centers with access to information to tell them what the environmental harms are of these data centers and how those environmental harms may impact them. So Irina's last question was, what would you do? What would you advocate for everyone to do? So I'd say these fall into two buckets. One is people should be made aware that AI data centers lead to environmental harms in a way that impacts them as people. And I think there are two parties, I mean, there are multiple parties responsible for this, but I think companies, when they're negotiating with a local government, need to make that local government aware, and they need to make the community aware of what the environmental impacts will be and how they may impact them in certain ways. And I also think independent research needs to be funded, because while I would like to believe that the companies will always do their due diligence, I do think independent research needs to be funded to examine what those impacts are and to work with communities to spread the word. And then I would say, I also think, oh, this is an earlier version of my slides, but that's okay. No, it's okay. I would also say we need regulation. And, you know, I do think that permitting provides some level of regulation. But you could see there are countries that are far ahead of us in terms of setting PUE standards and renewable energy standards and wastewater management. So I do think there needs to be regulation at a federal level that can then be implemented at the state and local levels. And that's it.
Going to ask Tseming in a second what he thinks we should be demanding of our representatives and regulators. But before that, I just wanted to mention that as far as I know, I think last week, the guidance that came out of the White House seemed to actually be pushing for faster, easier permitting for the development of data centers increasingly. So it's seen as a national security issue that we need to build at least as many as other countries. So all of those permitting rules might actually be lessened or treated differently than they are already. Go ahead.
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah, no. I wanted to actually just mention a couple of things just to follow up on what Betsy said about what should be done, right? So just as a follow-up to what I mentioned, there's a really broadly systemic problem that we have in this country with regard to environmental laws, which is that they're just outdated. EPA is trying to do climate change regulation without the Clean Air Act and other statutes really ever having considered climate and greenhouse gases as a problem, right? And so everything that comes out of there gets litigated, and they've lost a number of cases precisely because there's hostility and because of the belief that EPA doesn't have that authority. I think some broader regulatory reform just to give them the authority to address climate change would actually go quite far in being able to address some of these things. The other issue is really just information. I think this come up all the time here. you know, what Betsy mentioned, there was a news article that I saw, well, maybe it was the Washington Post and New York Times, about a city, a small town that was trying to fight a data center. They were ultimately successful, but they couldn't get any information about who the company was behind that and what all the issues were, right? And, you know, and to some extent that's natural. But we have all these models in the environmental regulatory scheme where there's lots of information about what company is doing in terms of releasing pollutants, the toxic release inventory, or even just to the environmental impact assessment process. Some of that can really be imported into this. And one specific thing I wanted to mention, which is maybe not something that would be readily apparent, but it seems to me also non-disclosure agreements in the tech industry that are so commonplace, I think probably is making it more difficult to really find out information. The Federal Trade Commission recently had issued this new rule making non-compete agreements, and so really related to these kinds of NDAs. I think you know, disfavoring them, and I think some change in that might potentially help. But the last thing, just to follow up on what Hirsch had mentioned, the social cost of carbon, that's a really big thing. You don't really need regulation. The problem is that this is where the hostility by the federal courts comes in. These things have been litigated, but that would be a really big game changer if this changed to $190 per ton of carbon would stick, because every regulation that EPA does depends on the cost-benefit calculus that generally has been difficult to push through.
So I want to take your questions, and as I'm walking out, one more quick question, which is, I may have been totally naive with this, but sometimes when people talk about AI being inevitably and it's coming and there's nothing to be done about that, I used to say, well, look at environmental law. We used to have lakes on fire and companies just dumping everything into the rivers, and now it's cleaner, it's better, right? We were able to address some things at the systemic level. So should I stop making that comparison? Is that an outdated, hopefulness?
No, I would say it takes time, right? I mean, this is, that improvement in the environmental quality didn't happen overnight. Really, it's taken 30-something years, really, before issues like acid rain and water quality, but things are a lot better. Not where everybody wants it to be, but significant. So
laws can make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. I don't think it's inevitable. I think there will be, I think things will improve if people pay attention and regulators take note.
All right, so okay, so out of curiosity, first of all, I just want to say I'm a freshman in college, so I probably don't have much information. But my question is, well, have people ever thought about putting data centers in space? Like as a satellite? I don't even know how much a data center, I don't know much about like how a data center works, so, well, it's just a question out of the air.
I don't know. Maybe you should ask Elon Musk.
I would suggest.
Sorry, I suspect some people in the room might know, because I think those have been proposed, right? This is not,
Yes. One of my colleagues and I just wrote a proposal to NASA for that. It turns out that you can find an orbit where you always have radiation on your solar panels, and that would be constant carbon-free energy. The question is, can you inexpensively launch that much hardware into space, which is where Elon Musk would come in. But I think so people are talking about it. It's kind of speculative.
Hi, Peter Hess from Berkeley. And this question actually goes all the way back to Emma's presentation this morning. I'm a retired academic, and when I retired at age 66, I went to a CAL FIRE Academy to become a wildland firefighter. And I am the co-founder of the Lake County Prescribed Burning Association, where we burn between November and June. And There are a couple of dimensions relating to AI here. My older son, Michael, is a Cal firefighter, but also has his own company in AI in San Francisco, and it's very interested in the application of AI to fire detection. The other question, and he also developed an app called Watch Duty that you should download if you're a Californian.
I have Watch Duty,
I
used it this summer.
Oh, it's a wonderful app.
When I evacuated my cabin in the mountains
great.
Of a fire.
And he's on the Watch Duty team, and they constantly talk about how can we make it better with AI. But my question to Emma this morning was, as a wildland fire practitioner, I pay attention all summer to 300 cameras that PG&E, out of its guilt, has funded, and they're monitored by UC San Diego. But to have human eyes on 300 cameras looking for the first wisp of smoke, people are thinking, what if we had AI do that? And my question to Emma was, what would be the carbon footprint of AI? And basically, Watch Duty now covers 13 Western states, not just California. I don't even know how to begin to calculate the footprint of an AI that could do that. But then again, as Emma said, the cost of avoiding major wildfires has probably a better carbon footprint than what AI might do. So I wonder if anybody has any ideas on how to assess this.
I really not know how to assess the carbon footprint of a model like that. Yeah, it's doable. It's not that hard to do. It just needs to be done. But also, I think this speaks to something that maybe we should have said at the very beginning of the conference, which is there is no such thing as one AI. And for, the kind of AI that looks for those kind of patterns and, smoke has a very different environmental footprint than the generative AI that writes your emails, right? And the generative AI that makes one image has a very different footprint than something that does text. So it really, each of the applications, this goes back to what we were talking earlier, each of the applications needs to have its own ethical analysis of whether it's worth the environmental cost. And so unfortunately, we kind of did a disservice by kind of blurring it all together because it doesn't really work that way.
Jonathan Jonitas here, one of your former students, Professor Yang, digital governance lawyer. I think my question for you is, in the absence of additional regulations or updating regulations, between your guys' opinions, what's some clever lawyering that can be done at litigants level to try to push the needle for either socializing these issues more so you get updates or actually achieving maybe some of these notable goals?
I would love to see a class action brought on behalf of the community that's been impacted. And I think that's something that could be done at the state level. I think that's something Rob Bonta and his team could do.
Yeah, I don't know. From my perspective, it's a little tough one. I think, a lot of the disclosures, disclosure laws that are coming online, I think once you have more information, I think there will be people will see more points to leverage actually these issues. The enforcement action in Greenwich against this crypto mine, actually, that's one example. And the challenge is we just don't know enough, I think, at this point about how these, how those things intersect.
So I think you raised a very great point about the local impacts of these AI computing. So how do we balance the local impacts versus the global impacts, especially given that it's really hard to quantify accurately the global impacts cost?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to downplay the global impacts. I do think, though, there does need to be significant focus. I guess I should say, I actually feel like most of the discussion is around the global impacts, right? Like GHG and emissions and, whereas less is on kind of the environmental impacts to the local populations and communities. So I actually think we need to expand discussion around both, but I think the most expansion of discussion has to be around the local impacts because those are the ones that have real immediate harm to people. And so I think both need to be there, but that's the part we need to expand the most.
I think one easy way to incorporate this is this issue of the social cost of carbon, right? Because that is supposed to be the number that goes into the regulation, and at least in the U.S. But I think this is a broader issue abroad. Whenever there are controversy or discussions about what to do, I think there's always the balancing going on. And unless you have a better number for what the cost is here that climate change imposes on the public and the environment, those discussions are just not very effective. So I think that's a big deal. I think that that the EPA is moving forward. To be honest, I don't know what the status is of that currently. I just know that that number is out there. But unfortunately, usually there is a regulatory process where this number has to go through the White House. I don't know where that is. And then, of course, we have the elections coming up.
This may not be a question for lawyers, but how does nuclear power factor into this whole equation? And could it be a benefit to the outputs being so harmful in many ways?
Well, so it's interesting. I don't know that much on it. We heard today that there are fewer GHG emissions from nuclear power, but there is often an increased water cooling with nuclear power. But again, I'm not the kind of environmental science expert, but it's the impact of kind of nuclear power plants on a local community is something we'll be exploring in our upcoming work. But someone else who spoke today might have a better answer.
Hi, I'm Susanna Hill from Cloud Sustainability Watch, and it seems from the way I've been looking at things that a lot of the limitations on the impact of the climate impact of generative AI have to do with the demand, how much corporations wish to use AI and how much they wish to deploy their data center services. And so from a regulatory standpoint, is there any part that demand regulation has to play in this? Doesn't seem like it's a regulatory angle we've taken in this country before, but Google and AWS can only serve the customers' demands that come into them, and they don't have that much control over what their customers wish to compute. And so I don't know from a regulatory standpoint if there's any thought that you have.
So I really don't like being the person who talks about the social cost of carbon because I'm not an economist. And usually these kinds of cost-benefit analysis are, from my perspective, is what I don't like. But trying to force companies to internalize the cost of providing these services will go a huge way. And part of the problem right now is that companies are not paying, the cost of the pollution they put out. And I think this has been alluded to already. A lot of things are subsidized, right? This is just the fossil fuel industry, but there's enormous subsidies going to the fossil fuel industry in terms of, when they bid for, drilling and all that stuff. So, that would go a long way. I think regulating demand is probably not in the cards, at least not in this country.
Okay, we have 3 questions lined up, and then I reserve the last 5 minutes.
So my question for the panelists is, if you had a magic wand and you could create regulations for data centers and just say what they would have to do and what the requirements would be and what the follow-up, look at them after that would be, what would you do? Or would you just not allow data centers?
The answer to this, if I were to do a full answer, this would be very long. But I guess I would say I would start. There obviously can't just not be AI data centers, nor do I think there should not just be AI data centers. But I always start with kind of the harm to humans and look at those the environmental impacts that cause the harms to humans. And I would start there by regulating the what causes the kind of urban heat islands, what causes the air pollution in the local community, what causes the water drainage, what causes the water pollution, what causes the heat, and I would start by looking at kind of immediate impacts and trying to regulate those pieces of it.
Here's one that I think. So I don't think that data centers or the tech industries in general is regulated as an industry. We have semiconductor manufacturing, and the idea behind it really would be, I think when you regulate data centers or we look at data centers as an industry or some industrial categories, you wouldn't look at only the building, or the equipment, or the energy generation of the power plants. You really should be looking at all of that together, and that might then give you some sense of where the problems are. There's this concept in environmental impact assessment of cumulative effects, right? All of these things that have cumulative effects because there's so many of them and they're incremental, and all these add up. And this is one of the problems here, that we just are not capturing how these data centers have effects elsewhere and how they all sort of contribute together, even though this is really one broader industry, sort of this development that all is connected.
If I may, is there any, about the question of making laws stick, is there any protection against the fickleness of politicians changing? Like, I'm thinking of the Paris withdrawal and things like that.
I think that's a great question. It comes up all the time, right? Which is, if you want environmental improvements, I think, there's a tendency, I think, in law school and for law students generally to look to the courts. I think the courts have proven at this point that they're not necessarily the protectors, of individual rights. I think this is a broader lesson actually in many other countries. People don't have that view. Legislation obviously is really important. I don't think that law in itself is really can always be the savior. I think it's really important, obviously, as embodying consensus about what people should do. But this is, there's no one magic bullet, I would say. From a practical perspective, short term, new statute, and of course having judges in place that are more favorable, absolutely, of course. But I think you do have to, sort of have long-term changes in how we view sort of the role of technology and all of this in our society.
So I'd say there are two things that give me hope. One is companies can go beyond what the law says. And the second is that right now in the US, so much of this is regulated at the local and state levels, and that doesn't necessarily have to change with the changing national administration. So I'd say those are the fact that it is kind of a more localized. I mean, I'd love to see standards set at the federal level, but without that, a lot can still happen kind of on the ground.